This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, anyplace. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History podcast. Today in the studio are Keith, Mathias, and Stephen. We're going to be talking about a variety of global subjects. Just a reminder before we begin, check out the hourofhistory.com/blog, Hour of History blog. We're uploading new content about some of the issues that we're talking about on the Hour of History podcast, and it's going to have links to sources about things like books and authors and historians that we talk about. So make sure to check out the blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And of course, we're posting about all of these on Twitter as well. So welcome, Keith, Mathias. Mathias, what's cooking in your brain?
Oh, well, so this is going to be kind of maybe like a little bit of like a nebulous, abstract episode. But I think what's important is, beyond the issue of North Korea, which is like blowing up the news right now, is to pay attention to the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine, in the area known as the Donbass in Ukraine. And I think it's interesting how, that's the area I professionally, quote unquote, study. And it's interesting how a lot of the propaganda surrounding the conflict has really started to circle around portraying Ukrainians as Nazis or sort of ultra right-wingers, and that Russia had to intervene or had to do something in Ukraine in order to prevent a kind of fascist coup or to prevent killings of ethnic Russians by these Ukrainian Nazis, which is not true. There are tiny kernels of truth, though, embedded within those kind of big propagandistic issues. More broadly, I was also thinking of kind of the history of anti-communism and like sort of ultranationalism in Eastern Europe, but also how that plays into the Cold War, where the U.S. recruits lots of very nasty right-wing figures globally as part of their, war against communism and socialism, and how a lot of those figures are still with us and still have really nasty repercussions, aka in Nicaragua and Central America, which is what Keith does, and then also American efforts to recruit like sort of anti-communist Cubans in the Bay of Pigs and everything, like you study, Steve. So I figured today we would do an episode kind of talking about these issues, sort of talking about the history of sort of anti-communist nationalism, the United States sort of usage of it, and also sort of the legacy of these issues in Eastern Europe and how those are playing into kind of the ever expanding and accelerating sort of crisis of democracy in that portion of the world.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting topic. And a lot of times, especially Keith and I, we're studying the communists and the revolutions, but and it kind of gets lost in the dialogue a little bit about the pushback, because whenever there's a push one way, there's almost always what is that, Newton's first law of physics?
No, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah,
right.
I don't know, physicists, write us in.
This is Newton's law of history.
That's a good setup for what we're going to talk about. One thing I would like also to add to that is not only this sort of anti-communist push for like a nationalist perspective, but I also would like to add a sort of like tie into the imperialist that preceded a lot of the communist revolution. So a lot of the communists are fighting imperialist colonization, and a lot of these nationalists ally themselves with the old imperial roots. So maybe we can bring in that.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely. Well. So I'll sort of kick it off talking about the situation in Ukraine, and then we can kind of sort of mosey from there. So in 2014, or I should rewind, flip that back. So starting in like December 2013, there was a massive protest movement in Ukraine against the current president at the time, I think Viktor Yushchenko. Yushchenko is basically a kind of Kremlin crony. He was basically kind of like a low-tier mob boss that was controlled by the Kremlin. He had just recently broken a kind of a trade agreement with the EU that had massive popular support within Ukraine. Many Ukrainians saw the breaking of that deal as a kind of destruction of Ukraine's attempts to join the EU and to become part of what they consider broader sort of European polity, and saw them being sort of drawn more into the orbit of Putin. And so there developed this huge protest movement in the Maidan, which is sort of the main square in Kiev. And then Maidan is just like the Ukrainian term for square anywhere. So, but it's like there's like some complicated Ukrainian word for the actual name of the square. So these protests went on for months into I think February, March, maybe even April of 2014. Eventually they got really violent. There was violent clashes on both sides. Not just, but much more on the side of the government. Yushchenko sort of let loose riot police and police snipers. Lots of people got killed. There was a final day of really bloody sort of conflicts, and then in response, the Ukrainians in the square basically said either Yanukovych has to go, or we're basically going to start a civil war. The next day, he fled to Russia and abandoned sort of his power. But immediately afterwards, in sort of this power vacuum, unmarked Russian Special Forces troops moved into Crimea, which is a sort of peninsula in the Black Sea that they had historically for centuries belonged to the Russian Empire. It had only technically been part of the Ukrainian nation since the fall of the Soviet Union. So Russian forces go in and annex Crimea, and then of course they start sending in kind of these nebulous, unmarked, troops and forces and sort of recruited gangs that they put into eastern Ukraine to try and recruit sort of disaffected people there. They claim that they established two, quote, independent states. They really only exist in the minds of the Russian government. They have no international recognition. And basically, Russia is sort of just kind of creating a low-level but ongoing crisis. It's variously been called like a Russian-backed, coup, a Russian-backed intervention, a Ukrainian civil war. Whatever you want to term it, but it's pretty nasty. About 10,000 people at this point, probably a few more, anywhere between 10 and 15,000 people have been killed in the last 4 years.
This is why Putin does not get to vacation with Trump and Trudeau in
and in reaction, there was a lot of sanctions that were put on Russia, yada, yada, yada. But the interesting thing about all these events, to me, is that sort of the Russian sort of propaganda machine went into action very quickly and portrayed what was happening in Ukraine, the Maidan protests, and then the Russian intervention in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. The Russian propaganda portrayed this as an effort by Russia to protect ethnic Russians from violence by neo-Nazi Ukrainians. And they portrayed the Maidan protest and the ousting of Yanukovych and kind of the bringing in of a new government as a fascist Nazi coup, and basically have really pumped out this idea that what's happening in Ukraine is it's sort of a nationalist movement that's being supported by ultra right-wing Nazi-ish forces, and that Russia has intervened in order to protect its people and to preserve some sort of order or sovereignty. Now, none of that is true. It does, however, the narrative as a whole isn't true, but it has kernels of truth in it, in the sense that in Ukraine, there was a ton of Nazi collaborators during World War II. There was a huge Ukrainian nationalist movement for most of the 20th century that the Soviet Union repressed pretty brutally. And then, so when the Nazis invaded Ukraine, they were actually greeted pretty well, right? They were greeted as sort of liberators in Ukraine, liberating Ukrainians from the Soviets. And so there's a lot of collaboration. A lot of Ukrainians would actually go on to fight as part of auxiliary forces for the Nazis a little bit. And so then after World War II, thousands of Ukrainian nationalists who had collaborated with the Nazis were killed and or put into the Gulag system. And so this created a really intense kind of animosity between basically Russians and Ukrainians broadly within the Soviet Union. And so after the collapse of the Soviet Union, those tensions have lived on. And while we haven't initially, right-wing forces weren't a huge part of kind of the Ukrainian civil unrest and pushback against Yanukovych, as this conflict has continued, nationalist forces in Ukraine have gotten stronger, right? Because any sort of conflict with another nation boosts nationalist forces. And so you are seeing now the rise of more radical right-wing, even neo-Nazi groups within Ukraine, almost as in a response to Russian propaganda, almost willing them into being somehow. And so it's a really nasty situation. And I think, though, it goes to this broader issue of unresolved tensions of kind of nationalism and its alliance with right-wing forces in Eastern Europe and the legacy of World War II in the Soviet Union. particularly right, we're seeing a big right-wing nationalist resurgence in Poland, in Hungary, all of which is being sort of aided and abetted by sort of oligarchic and corrupt powers, but those forces are real. And I think that is also interesting because after World War II, the United States definitely cultivated right-wing forces as part of an anti-communist movement, right? So in Europe, particularly in like Italy and France, there was this thing called Operation Gladio, which was basically an American-backed CIA kind of recruitment of right-wing figures who basically they said you're going to be part of like a guerrilla force. If there is ever like a Soviet invasion of Europe, you are going to be like our people behind the front line, sort of.
Right. Well, they do this all over.
Yeah.
Keith, what do you think about this? Like, do you see parallels there with the way the U.S. acted in Central America?
In a sense, I mean, before I go on to that, I kind of want to ask Mathias a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I didn't know much about that collaboration between Ukraine and the Nazis. Like, so do the Ukrainian nationalists that reject the Soviet Union, do they kind of adopt the sort of xenophobic far-right rhetoric of the Nazis, or are they just kind of in it for their own personal interest?
Usually in it for their own personal interest. I mean, it's really complicated and hard to parse out. This isn't to say, right, I'm not saying that, like all Ukrainians were collaborators with Nazis, not by any means. I mean, the Nazis killed, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. And then also many, many, many Ukrainians, because they were part of the Soviet Union, got drafted into the Soviet forces and then fought in the Red Army. And if you look at it statistically by ethnic breakdown within the Soviet Union, I think Ukrainians actually suffered the most casualties of any group, excepting, of course, Russians within the Soviet Union. But then, of course, it gets into the bigger issue of what exactly is the difference between being Ukrainian and being Russian, right? That's some deep historical waters. Well, basically, it's that, in Ukraine, right, it had been sort of a central hub of Stalinization, right? So Ukraine is where there was all the massive collectivization of farms, which accompanying, violence, lots of brutality. There was the Holodomor, or the Great Famine in the early 30s that wiped out, we estimate, at least 3 million people. Then, of course, there was the Russian Civil War, which also killed lots of people in Ukraine. And then there was World War I, in which the Germans had in World War I even also made it into Ukraine. So millions of Ukrainians had died within like a 20-year time span. So when the Nazis came in, it was seen by a lot of Ukrainians as a reprieve from the Soviets. They thought, well, thank God, we can just go back to living our lives and just do our farming and live like our lives and not have to worry about the Soviets. This was also an interesting anecdote. So there's anecdotes of Nazi soldiers being greeted with bread and salt by like the Ukrainian peasants, which is like a traditional kind of like welcoming greeting. There's also anecdotal accounts that many Ukrainians saw. So I don't know if you know, like this, like on the Wehrmacht, which was like the main Nazi military, they had kind of this cross emblem, kind of, right? Like it wasn't exactly the Iron Cross, but you see it like on old like Nazi material and tanks and whatnot. Just kind of this cross. It's more like a military symbol. Ukraine, right, also keep in mind the Soviets were viscerally anti-religious, and so there was a lot of, repression of religious expression. Ukraine was a pretty devout area, and so many, many, many Ukrainians still harbored, sort of sympathies or had family members who were involved with the church. And so when they saw this symbol on sort of Nazi military hardware, they interpreted that as a symbol that the Nazis were Christian and were there to like preserve religion, which is totally not the case, right? It's sort of a case of horrible misinterpretation. And then, of course, the Nazis didn't really want to treat the Ukrainians well because they saw them as like Slavic, subhumans or something. But there were some Ukrainians that got recruited into these auxiliary troops with Nazi Germany. And then also we know that there definitely were some sort of Ukrainian kind of paramilitary groups that were active in the Holocaust in Ukraine. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it's a really turbulent issue, right? Because nominally in Europe, part of the Cold War with the United States was we want to get rid of, communism so we can give these nations their sovereignty back. Like we want to, we want these Poles, like these Poland, we want Poland to have its country back. We want these people in Eastern Europe to have their country, and have their community back. But the problem is a lot of that rhetoric tied in very nicely with lots of these nationalists who were viscerally anti-communist and who also sometimes in some cases had really troubling legacies with Nazi collaboration, right?
You see, I don't buy that American, like, we want to give Poland. America didn't give a fuck about Poland. America wanted to get geopolitical power. I'm going to use the example of Korea rather than talk about Cuba. Korea is a country that was occupied by the Japanese in 1910. It becomes part of Imperial Japan, even though it was sovereign. It was recognized by the United States as a sovereign nation. Before that, there were Koreans in the United States getting American educations, being trained at American war colleges, things like that. And after World War II, it mirrors a lot of what Mathias just said. The Japanese fall, and the United States, shortly after the bomb is dropped in Nagasaki, decide that they're going to split Korea up. They're going to divide it on the 38th parallel, this invisible line that they made on a National Geographic map as they're sailing to Korea, and that they were going to start this sort of system that could prevent communism from spreading through the entire Korean peninsula, because beginning in the 1920s and 1930s, Koreans were leading the charge against the Japanese in Manchuria, in Manchukuo, fighting against the Japanese Empire, trying to liberate Korea with no help from the United States. And so the same sort of argument was made, like the United States is really protecting the liberty of Korea and from communism or whatever. But in reality, the United States wanted a sweet base in Korea so they could check China's power, whatever happens in China, and so they could be close to the Soviet Union. So they set up, basically in the entire shape of an imperial government. They keep the people who were in charge of the Japanese Imperial Army in Korea. They put them in power. They, establish dictatorships to build Korean nationalism, supposedly, nominally anti-communist, anti-North Korea. But they really just are establishing what is the same as the Imperial Japan. And so the Koreans who were, backing this new Republic of Korea sound similar to these Ukrainians who were willing to fight Russia, the Soviet Union, at any cost. These Koreans were willing to fight Japan at any cost. And so it's kind of this weird mix of continuing this Japanese imperialist system in order to fight communism, while at the same time choosing these extreme nationalist dictators who are ending up protecting American interests in fighting against communism. And so I don't really buy this, like, the United States wanted to liberate or support these areas. Really, the United States was just concerned about its own geopolitical power and maintaining power in Asia.
Right.
That's that's how I sort of read the situation in Asia. And then when the Korean War comes, it's sort of like the United States has an opportunity to take all of Korea until China and the Soviet Union enter in, and it gets back to the stalemate where North Korea is never really recognized as a legitimate government of Korea, simply because the United States didn't recognize communist government.
But I think what you're seeing now is right-wing forces pushing back against American hegemony in the claims of nationalist sovereignty.
In Ukraine?
Well, I think just sort of globally, right? But I think, right, like, isn't that what we're seeing in Eastern Europe? Is people saying, down with evil sort of America and globalism and George Soros, right? We want our nation back or something like that. Or like Brexit, like get rid of like this like meddling internationally by the United States.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of...
the tables have turned.
Well, yeah, because it's no longer like sort of, you can't veil it as we're liberating you from the communists.
Yeah, so this is a question I was thinking then during the Cold War is the Cold War, and I think this is like a bigger issue, right? Is that, did the U.S. ever really give a damn about communism, or was it or was the Cold War an efficient and useful kind of smokescreen for the expansion of American power? Or both.
I think both. There's definitely like factions of America that are very concerned about communism. But yeah, it does like the whole thing about communism, right, in the sort of developing or third world, whatever you want to call it, global south, right, is that communism was a way of sort of moving away from European interests, right? Like Vietnam or something. Ho Chi Minh initially, right, was a big admirer of Woodrow Wilson, wanted to meet with him at the Paris conference after World War I, but Wilson turned him away, and that's when he kind of went to the Soviet Union, got interested in communism and things like that, right? I mean, in Nicaragua, communism or socialism, right, was also a nationalistic project, right? A way of kind of establishing Nicaraguan sovereignty, not being kind of this place that just supplied the United States with cheap coffee and things like that, establishing itself, and being able to protect its own interests, have control over its own land, etc., right?
Which is like similar to North Korea,
totally.
where they're more interested in having national sovereignty and getting rid of the Japanese imperialism, American intervention. That's their whole arguing point, And so what happens is when you have these counter-revolutionary groups, and now excuse me for switching continents, but when you have counter-revolutionary groups, like 2 years after Fidel Castro comes to power, there's the Bay of Pigs invasion, and who's to say Castro's government would have been legitimate in Cuba for a long period going forth? But instead, what happens is the United States decides, okay, well, let's send 1,000 counter-revolutionaries, and they'll just retake Cuba and everything will be okay. That fails, and then immediately sort of Castro's argument has legitimacy. Same sort of thing. It's a little different in North Korea because North Korea actually starts the Korean War, but they have the argument that, look, South Korea might be nominally independent, but South Korea is just loaded with thousands and thousands of American troops. So, okay, and they're, Park Chung-hee, their first dictator, he's a product of the American education system, so these guys don't really have legitimacy. The counter-revolutionaries never sort of have legitimacy, but when they challenge the communist leaders, the communist leaders get more legitimacy.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost, because like the anti-communists have this idea that communism is incredibly oppressive, and that the people living under communism have these horrible lives. And to an extent that becomes true, but it becomes true because I think, right, in the case of Cuba, I don't know much about North Korea, but I imagine it's like somewhat similar, right? That the conditions within those countries get more repressive as the kind of conditions outside are challenging those governments feel threatened, etc., right? Absolutely. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, well, so certainly in the case of Cuba, these countries get progressively worse, right? As they continue to be attacked from the counter-revolutionary forces, but they never relinquish power because that's their whole point. So every time they're attacked by a counter-revolutionary force, they're legitimized.
Yeah. Because
they're saying, look, we're right, the world is attacking us. And then the United States won't attack the terrorists. I mean, enormous amount of terrorist attacks have happened in Cuba from 1960 to the current day. As recently as 2000s, hotels were being bombed in Cuba. You don't even hear about it in American news. And the people who do the bombings go back and live in Florida. Yeah. So as long as that kind of thing happens, the revolutionary governments are still being legitimized, even though the people are suffering, they're going to hang on to power.
So this is interesting because it almost sounds like you guys are arguing that sort of American pushback, American anti-communism, not just that makes communism more repressive, but also that it kind of makes communism more nationalistic because it focuses it on a single area.
Yeah.
Right. Sort of how we think of North Korea. I mean, sure, we say it's communist, but we also think of it as kind of a pretty nationalistic state, with the big military parades.
That's the Juche.
Yeah, the Juche, and
if almost, Trump ever finds out about Juche, we might become a Juche.
Well, he basically has Art of the Deal basically is American Juche. It is. It's just it is it's like New Thought or whatever Trump has did you ever read about the book The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale?
I've heard of it.
Yeah,
but no, I've never read it.
Oh, so that has had a huge influence on Trump actually. Growing up, he went to a church that guy preached at, and a lot of Trump's rhetoric is just believe it'll be great and it will be great. So anyways, that's American Juche.
Yeah,
American spirit of capitalism, Protestantism. Wow. Anyways, but so I think that's an interesting argument. Right, that and this is something I personally study. Right, is how does nationalism and communism interact? right? Because I think it's usually taken as obvious for most people that, yeah, right-wing people or right-wing movements, counter-revolutionary movements, are usually ultra-nationalist movements. But the connection between communism and nationalism is weird because I think communism is supposed to be, like, by definition, not like an anti-nationalist thing.
It's supposed to be an international.
Yeah, it's supposed to be yeah. And so it's not supposed to like focus on the nation. But then the American doctrine of containment sort of forced virtually every communist government to turn inward and almost become nationalist in order to preserve itself.
Right.
I think you see this a lot, and kind of wheeling this somehow back to Ukraine and Russia. You see this a lot with the Soviet Union, right, where the Soviet Union initially, right, really tries to stamp out sort of nationalist expression, at least among Russians. It does a lot of like sort of building up of like nationalist stuff with other groups, but that's a different can of worms. But after the Nazi invasion during the war, right, the Soviet Union really starts to emphasize in its propaganda sort of the greatness of the Russian people, because they see it as we need to somehow mobilize, you know, the people to fight the Nazis, and our biggest ethnic group in the Soviet Union by far is the Russians, and so we need to somehow emphasize the Russianness of the Soviet Union. And so that you see all this rhetoric come out of how, like, basically, you know, like, yeah, everyone in the Soviet Union is equal, but like we all know the Russians are the most equal
Right.
type rhetoric comes out. And so you see this then, right, even after the war, right, this kind of emphasis that the Soviet Union, like its broad foundation is supposed to be Russia and the greatness of Russia, and how the Soviet Union basically tries to kind of like co-opt the history and cultural kind of literature and norms of the old Russian Empire as its foundation. But then that creates tension after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because then, you know, what happens to relationships between, example, Ukrainians and Russians, right? Like, how do you think about your past, right? Like, how do you emphasize your identity? And this is also a problem because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have lots of nominally ethnic Russians in other countries, right? Because Russians were living everywhere in the Soviet Union. So you have lots of Russians now living in Ukraine or Belarus or in the Baltics or in Central Asia, like all over. And so you see this weird thing of like how the Soviet Union's emphasis on its Russianness in order to like preserve itself sort of is now being used as kind of like a weaponized like tactic by a new resurgent nationalist Russia, claiming it has sovereign interests wherever there are ethnic Russians in countries that border it.
And I think part of this problem comes from the sort of communist perception of history, and the lack of like actual history that's done. Like there's a big billboard in Havana that says "Have faith in your history" outside the office of the historian, and just that term, "Have faith in your history," that's not how history is done. But in the communist sort of world, it's a narrative. History is a march right towards this end goal.
Right.
And I think in states that are no longer communist, that sort of faith in the history has created the space for like these hyper nationalists. So like I almost think the counter revolutionaries, rather than sending 1,000 people to the Bay of Pigs at night, a terrible place to go, like beautiful coral reefs for scuba diving, but not a good place to do a night invasion on the water, which, it fails miserably. Instead of doing that, and instead of bombing airplanes and killing innocent people, and they bomb like 20 different the Cuban radicals in New York, 20 different airline offices in New York City, like that does nothing. Rather than do that, they should just teach history and like, a more nuanced view of history. And like when these communist regimes collapse, like that's the real void. It becomes a battle for history. And the nationalists sort of trumpet this like, great narrative. And I think the same thing is kind of happening in Poland and things like that, where like, people are like making appeals to like medieval Poland now. That kind of stuff probably wasn't covered in the communist curriculum of 1980s Poland. I don't know. So I think these counter-revolutionaries would have been more successful if, rather than being terrorists, they had sort of waited it out and taught and wrote and spoke. Wouldn't that have worked?
What do you think?
I was going to ask what you think, Keith, like in terms of like Nicaragua.
like, so let me try and parse what Steve's question is. Just that, like, if the counter-revolutionaries had made more of an effort to kind of, like, engage and kind of put forth an alternative narrative and things like that. Yeah.
Rather than, like, just invade.
Right. I mean, the funny thing about history, right, is that any kind of demographic, right, has their examples that they can, like, draw back on, like, breaking out the seltzer. Yeah.
Breaking out some LaCroix. You know, going hardcore.
I just read that, like, so I guess in Nicaragua, the kind of, I don't know. I mean, I wonder what the kind of the counter-revolutionaries, like, what would their historical example that they would draw on be? I don't actually totally know. I guess, like, yeah, I don't know.
I'm thinking like it's just for me it's a really interesting process where you see a lot of post-Soviet or like post-communist states basically falling into like authoritarian kind of governments or getting wrapped up in lots of weird hyper-nationalist movements, and arguably, right, the most what we would think of like hardcore reactionary regimes in the world right now are also ones that were formerly communist at some point. And to my mind, that's a really weird dichotomy. Like, how do you get these movements coming out of parts of the world that were under the rule of a movement and an idea that claimed to be about, you know, liberating all of humanity and all these great ideals, right? It seems really kind of weird to me.
Yeah.
And I think, though, that... so this is what you see in Russia today. You see, like, figures like Lenin and Stalin being used by Russian nationalists to claim, like, the greatness of Russia, which is really weird, right? I mean, like, Lenin's definitely, like, rolling over in his mausoleum right now. I think, like, there's all these polls that have come out in the last few years showing that, like, Stalin right now is, like, considered by Russians to be, like, one of the greatest figures in their history, like, definitely, like, in the top 3, which is bonkers, right? When you think about it. But it's interesting because I think, Steve, you kind of pointed out well that after the collapse of communism, and communism just inherently has a very rigid notion of history, right? There's not a lot of room for nuance. That history basically wasn't taught, or it wasn't, you know, the real goings-on of human people's lives just were not taught. And so after the collapse of communism, there's nothing there to fill that void. And I think it's easy in those situations for people to latch on to other kind of big narratives, which tend to be nationalistic right-wing narratives about the greatness of the nation. And then old figures of the communist past can then be easily co-opted into nationalist usages, right? So that's why I think you're seeing in Russia today, like Lenin and Stalin being basically used as nationalistic figures. And I think this is also why, though, you see nationalists in Russia abuse, you know, this propaganda of claiming Ukrainians as Nazis, because that's all they have to go on, right? Like, the big enemy that many people still remember in Eastern Europe was the Nazis. And yet, right, like, usually the people in Eastern Europe that are calling other people Nazis also tend to be really right-wing figures themselves, you know? Which is why I think you see this really weird, perverse propaganda thing, right, with, like, George Soros, where people want to claim, oh, George Soros was, like, a collaborator with the Nazis, you know? Like, it's, like, this weird thing of, like, all of the terms and all of, like, the ideologies have been flipped, but we still we still use the same figures, but all of, like, the semantic meaning behind everything has been flipped. If that makes sense.
Well, I think it's possible. I think it's possible to do that sort of thing with a void in history, but it just goes back to, like, this sort of root that people are just trying to remain in power, and they'll sort of do anything to do that. Like, to remain in power, which sort of makes, like, countries like Cuba and North Korea all the more extraordinary, is because they remained in power this entire time, one way or another, throughout all the counter-revolution. I mean, if there's ever, like, sort of a, you know, test of how these counter-revolutionary measures have failed, just look at who's in power and how long they've been in power. Like, it's really interesting, the comment that Trump is going to stop war games in Korea.
War exercises, Steve.
No.
Sorry, I saw lots of people on Twitter being like, "They're not war games; they're war exercises."
Can we explain like what?
And I was like, that doesn't matter.
Well, like what are they doing in that? Maybe we should like clarify
military exercises. So
right. So like maybe like
so like the South Korean military has a mandatory inscription. So if you're an 18-year-old male in Korea, you get called to the South Korean army. You must go serve for a couple years, and they can put you on the DMZ. They can put you on a ship, whatever. And after your service, you're still liable to be called back. You're active until you're like 40 or something. Whether or not you're in the United States or whatnot, that's you as a Korean. So South Korea has a very big military. Obviously, North Korea has a massive military too, and the United States has a lot of thousands of active troops in South Korea. So they do joint military exercises. The South Korean government and the United States government. So like the South Korean Navy will have ships out on the coasts in the disputed sort of waters, the East Sea and things like that, where they'll do military exercises. And like, so that was one of like Trump's big points, right. Is that like, okay, so, and where's the US's Air Force? We have Air Force or Navy bases in Japan and Guam, so we're sending our aircraft from Japan and Guam, which are like, that's quite a distance to go to Korea to like sort of drop bombs in the sea. And what does that really serve? So it costs a lot of money to carry out these exercises, and I think the sort of philosophy of this in the past was, we're doing this right on North Korea's doorstep. Like, that's an insult to North Korea's sovereignty to carry out military exercises in like sort of shared waters between China, North Korea, South Korea, or North Korea, South Korea, and Japan is like sort of a big affront to North Korea, and I think that's why why the United States did it for a long time.
Right.
But that's sort of like what I'm talking about, these ineffective counter-revolutionary measures. Like has that really put off Korean War Part 2?
No, and I mean, like when I heard about this yesterday, like my thought, right? And like maybe this is something we can talk about, right? That would only get like, and this is what you're saying too, that only gives legitimacy to Kim Jong-un, right? Yeah. That only makes the regime more and more repressive, right? Because they're constantly like faced with these threats right along their border. And to me, like the argument like that sort of, absolutely we should be concerned with human rights in North Korea, totally. But I think ending those kind of provocations along the border, right, will improve human rights in the sense that, right, the regime will have less and less legitimacy to repress people within their own borders because they're not faced with these attacks along the outside. So to me, that's an argument for sort of going along this path towards denuclearization on the peninsula.
Yeah, and it's kind of like it's been so cringeworthy to watch because everyone wants to be anti-Trump so bad that they're not willing to consider like what no U.S. president met with a North Korean leader, right? Jimmy Carter tried to do some stuff in the 70s, and that was sort of at North Korea's, like when North Korea still was a relatively non-failed state. South Korea was still a dictatorship that wasn't doing so well. So, like that was even more, and Vietnam, like people were still really, communism was a real threat. So that was even more intense back then. But like meeting with a leader at this point, it just seems like why not, Yeah. So despite who Trump is or whatever, like.
Let's shift gears here for a second. Okay. Because I do want to do like a whole episode in North Korea, but.
But I know like, you have like a different view on this, right?
I don't know. Like touching briefly on it, like like I agree that military war games, exercises, whatever you want to call them, like those are silly. Like we should definitely stop doing those. I definitely think that it's a good thing to try and initiate some sort of diplomatic talks. That's a good thing. I guess I just worry in all of this. Like, I'm not worried about like legitimizing like North Korea or whatever. Like, that's just silly rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't. Like, no, it's like what do you mean? Like, they're legitimate because they exist at this point, right? Right? Like, it doesn't matter what we do or not. But I do worry that there's like this weird idea that if we just suddenly, I don't know. Like, I just worry about. It's not like I have a good rational thought, but I just think that in the midst of all these talks, like, sure, even if North Korea shuts down like its total nuclear capacity, right, or whatever the acronym is, like CIVID or something, even if that happens, I just don't know. Like, I guess I just wonder what the end game is, and I guess like that's just kind of asking too much, right? The end game is just to reduce tension and to reduce chances of nuclear war, and that's a good thing. But I guess I just worry, like, I mean, nukes or no nukes, right? North Korea is still like an awful dictatorship, and the lives of the North Korean people are still going to be awful. And I guess I just have, it's more of like a gut feeling or a worry that I just don't know if Trump is the guy to be pulling this off. Well, I mean, but again, I know that's sort of like a knee-jerk anti-Trumpism, right? Like, talks are good, getting rid of the nukes is good, it's all good. I just have this weird worry that in the long game, I wonder, like, well, what's going to happen to, like, a kid, like a North Korean kid that's, like, 10 years old? Like, how is all of this going to actually improve their life going forward? And we could just say, like, well, it'll be improved by they have a lessening chance of being, like, fried to death by a nuclear bomb. And that's a good thing, right? I just have a worry about, like, the long-term prospects of this, of whatever the talks are going to result in, and whether this is actually going to change anything, or if this is going to sort of like create this weird dichotomy of we engage in talks and we sort of welcome North Korea into the broader international community at the expense of sort of biting our tongues at criticizing North Korea's, violations of what we did an episode of Humorous, but like basically, North Korea's like brutality, in the hopes that we don't want to antagonize North Korea because then they could develop nukes again. And I just worry that that's the dichotomy that might be set up.
Well, so this will bring us back to what we started on, but this is, to me, this is exactly the problem in the analysis, that for some reason the American necessity to worry about the 10-year-old North Korean boy.
And yeah, maybe I'm just like a dirty American.
But this
like,
is exactly the problem, is because of the same sort of rhetoric is used by the sort of Cuban counter-revolutionaries in the United States who have been terrorizing Cuba for so many years.
And maybe I should be more concerned with like some 10-year-old black kid in North Philly who like also has horrible life prospects.
Right. But this argument is used all the time by the sort of Cuban nationalist organizations that are anti-Castro regime, are always saying the human rights record is so bad. What about the average Cuban? The average Cuban doesn't have a good life. We can't deal with this government, so on and so forth. In the meantime, like, the activities that are going on are not helping change these lives, nor is it necessarily the United States' duty to do that. Like, so after the revolution, one of the first things Castro does is his literacy campaign. Thousands of volunteers go from Havana to the outskirts of Cuba to teach people to be literate, right? They're holding classes for farmers. This is where the counter-revolutionary terrorism starts. There's cases of teachers, the teachers are 14 to 16-year-old, girls and boys, being murdered by people who are anti-Castro.
Right.
Sorry,
keep going. Yeah.
So like these are the first cases, even before Bay of Pigs. This is the 1960s. Yeah. And like straight up taking these people who are teaching farmers how to read out, and like one guy's hanged alive, and there's books on this kind of stuff, and the counter-revolutionary things. And these are the same people who are arguing like Castro's regime is going to ruin the life for these Cubans.
Well, because undermining their success, right, undermines their kind of longevity. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, the same thing happened in Nicaragua, like play by play, same thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, because the Nicaraguans, the example that they wanted to emulate was the example of Cuba, right? So the Sandinistas cut the literacy rate in a series of 2 to 3 years, like, nearly in half.
You mean cut the illiteracy rate?
Illiteracy rate, I'm sorry, yeah. Yes, they're like, everybody don't read. Yeah.
No more books.
And so I think, like this idea that...
Well, let me say one more thing. Sorry. No, it's okay. And the Contras, right? The one of the first things that they did was burn these schoolhouses to the ground, burn the kind of medical facilities that the Sandinistas set up in the countryside to the ground in order to limit the amount of successes that the new government could achieve, right? Much like these anti-communist guerrillas that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. No. So I think that's. I guess the point is maybe something we've been driving at is right the way that these political forces basically kind of fuel each other and kind of bring out the worst in each other.
Yeah.
Well, but they need not like. So
But they don't. Yeah, but they don't have to. But it seems like, especially right with the Cold War now, like, anti-communism feeds, kind of communist entrenchment, which then leads to like a weird breeding of nationalism and communism, and then also right kind of like it just seems like these things like they're counterproductive, right? Because they both kind of hit each other and then they both ripple back on themselves with repercussions that neither of them initially planned on.
And I think where the real sort of failures happen is when a government isn't good enough or isn't effective enough to check these sort of things. So the Cuban counter-revolutionaries who are, and I don't want to sound like totally apologist for the Cuban Revolution, not everything went well in the revolution, so on, and like, there are certainly arguments to be had for the people who their homes were taken and they had to go to Florida, right? But at the same time, the way the Cuban exiles in Florida took over the U.S. government, voted their own into office, so on and so forth, and protected these people who were terrorists, who were going to Cuba and carrying out terrorist acts like the bombing of Cubana Flight 455 in the 1970s. In 1976, 70 plus people are killed because a guy in Florida leaves a bomb in a suitcase on a Cubana flight. Like, innocent people killed. And you know what the U.S. government does? By the 1970s, the U.S. government is so anti-Cuba and so pro-Cuban exile, the U.S. government does nothing. And these people live in Cuba. One of them just died this year. They live out their life in Florida, untouched by the government. So what I'm saying is, like, when the government is ineffective in controlling these sort of counter-revolutionaries, when they're allowed to like sort of live in a place, they can exploit to great gain these movements. So I'm saying, like, in Europe, the fact that Ukraine has such an unstable government already, and the fact that Russia has that instability, and not a real effective government that can check things, really opens up the world to all kinds of bad people.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, well, I think too we should also bring up like School of the Americas and kind of American training of military officers and police officers from Latin American countries, and then to be quote unquote anti-communist forces, and they ship them back to their countries where they basically become like leaders of death squads, right? Which is pretty nasty. I think, yeah, and I don't know. I mean, does this mean that maybe would like American would the world be better if American involvement was less, right? Because I feel like the neoconservative kind of position is that the American involvement in the world is a good thing, but maybe the opposite case is that if we just weren't as involved, a lot of these issues just wouldn't exist in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would start totally with the Cuba situation. Had America when Castro comes to the United Nations and Che Guevara comes to the United Nations, had the U.S. sort of pressed them and said, well, you've got to pay these people back in some way. You stole houses, you stole companies, you destroyed companies, you have to pay them back somehow. If they had said that and not trained militaries to go invade and not, I don't know. It would have been interesting to see if within 2 years, the missile crisis would have happened. Would the Soviets have put missiles in Cuba anyway if the U.S. didn't try to send anti-Castro army in?
That's
a really fascinating question. Like, I was reading the other day. So my question is, like, When does Castro declare like the Cuban Revolution like Marxist-Leninist? Because I know that initially, right, like some anti-communists were like involved in overthrowing Batista too.
Well, I mean, so that's like something that you hear a lot of the time.
Right.
But I mean, as early as his "History Will Absolve Me" speech.
When is that?
In the 55, after the attack on Moncada Barracks. So like, he's already talking about land redistribution, and like, you don't have to say it's Marxist-Leninist. But the land redistribution was always going to happen.
Right, absolutely, because it's Latin America.
Yeah, so that's immediate with the revolution.
Okay.
So the U.S. was always so that was sort of the challenge, and this is like gets back to Mathias's question is, so can something happen 90 miles away from the United States that the U.S. is totally opposed to, and the U.S. still not intervene? And would it be better for the world?
Would it be better for the world? I mean, I think that like we have to understand that like in places like Guatemala and Cuba and Nicaragua, like land redistribution like is like not necessarily like something that we should view as communism, but rather sort of a way of dealing with the inequalities of sort of the post-colonial Latin American state, right? In these places, like, I mean, I don't know Cuba as well, but like in Central America, right? After sort of the expansion of capitalism into the countryside, right? These places that had been owned communally, like we're talking about the Mexican Revolution, same thing, right? Owned communally by these indigenous peoples, by these peasants for decades and decades, are taken away from them and bought up by these haciendas, bought up by these coffee growers, etc., right? And, you know, those peasants, like, they weren't reading Lenin, but they wanted a return to, right, their traditional way of communally owning the land, right? And communism offered them that, right? And so when the United States comes in and says that, no, you can't have it the way that you've always had it because that represents something we're ideologically opposed to them, like, they don't look so good,
but
right?
again, this is odd. That's interesting. Yeah. That again, I think ties into our point of like this weird bleed over point of like communism and I guess sort of like a quasi nationalism, right? Where peasants are glomming on to communism not because they're Marxists or anything, or because they're communists, but because they just like, we want our land back so we can just live like our regular normal lives the way we knew it, right? Like we just like, in land is like that's like an eternal nationalistic trope of like, you know, power to like, we want our land, you know, we want our people and our land, which easily boils over and like, I think at its end goal
goes into nationalism,
or almost like, you know, and perversely if you go far right enough, like blood and soil type thing. And so I think it's interesting, like for me, the more I read about this in the Cold War, it's like I guess I get less interested in like the actual ideology of like capitalism and communism, but like the way, why do people in certain parts of the world join or glom, like what do they find appealing about these ideologies? Not because of what these ideologies are saying, but what are these ideologies doing for them? Right. And then what's their original motivation?
And I think that's why history, I'm always plugging history, but I guess it is the Hour of History podcast.
Good thing to plug.
No, but that's why history is so important, because if no one talked about North Korean history when they were talking about the Trump and Kim summit. But if you go back to Kim Il-sung, when he's fighting against the Japanese takeover of Manchuria, the Koreans make up like 90% of the resistance against the Japanese in Manchukuo, in what is now China. And what do they want? They just want the Japanese out. They want their own country back, basically. And so, like, I mean, that's so at the root of North Korean nationalism that when Kim Il-sung wants to unite the Koreas, when he tries to invade South Korea, Mao doesn't want to do it, Stalin doesn't want to do it, and they're like, don't do it, Kim. Like, this is a bad idea. The U.S. is going to fight you, and then it's going to be like all of us are going to have to fight. But Kim Il-sung's number one goal was a united Korea. Like, he didn't, he had the communist ideology attached. But it's sort of like we need to go back, like you said, to these roots, and like, why did Kim Il-sung actually? What did he really want to establish?
I think another figure we talked about earlier was like Ho Chi Minh. Who I think of Ho Chi Minh ultimately as basically a kind of Vietnamese nationalist. Totally. Like at the end of the day, like that's what he was. And communism, I often think with Ho Chi Minh was just like what he found the best way to achieve that and integrate Vietnam into like a broader international framework. But like his overriding goal was always kick out the French and establish an independent, Indo-Chinese state. And I think a lot of communists, if you look at it, around especially what you were talking about, like the third world, the global south, however you want to term it, that's like their motivation, is what we would think of as like primarily a kind of nationalist drive of get rid of these imperialists and just let us live our lives in like our own country.
Which is why I kind of see like, so these counter-revolutionaries, and I kind of talked about it at the beginning of the episode, I kind of see the counter-revolutionaries as sort of like neo-imperialists. Because they want to go back to these structures that were straight out of imperialism. The Cubans who want to retake Cuba want to reestablish the, giant Spanish plantations that, for better or worse, dominated Cuba for 6 centuries. So they it's sort of like these neo-imperialist efforts, which again totally vindicates the revolutionary or the anti-imperialist argument that they're just trying to recolonize our country.
Right. Yeah, and I think too, again, if you look at this with the Soviet Union, that's also a big overriding principle for lots of people that joined the revolution. It's not like they had read Marx or Lenin and knew the ideology. It's just that they were like saying, hey, the Bolsheviks want to break up the large estates and get rid of the noblemen and allow us to have our own farms and land. And everyone's like, hell yeah, that sounds pretty great, right? And then, of course, we know how it later gets pretty nasty, but I think it's always interesting to keep in mind, like, why do people join those movements, like we were talking about? And a lot of it, like I said earlier, is what we would think of as a kind of basic, almost nationalistic impulse, is just leave us alone and let us do our own thing in our own territory.
Right? Yeah, and I think we should stress how high the stakes are. Like, when we're talking, revolutionaries, counter-revolutionaries, I mean, in almost every case, these are people willing to die or kill innocent people for their chosen ideology, which is like kind of, especially to Americans, like sort of disconcerting and frightening, because in America now, especially now where like you just send a drone abroad and like we don't even read about 90% of the things that happen, in these cases that we've been talking about, Ukraine, Cuba, North Korea, Nicaragua, like a lot of people have died, both people fighting and people who are just trying to live their lives. But just the sort of amount of human sacrifice for this is the right way argument, it's extraordinary. So like I think that's an important thing to remember whenever we talk about these sort of like these are people willing to kill and willing to be killed for this.
Yeah. Would we say that maybe what links perhaps like communism and nationalism in some sense is like a common kind of anti-imperialism in a sense?
Well, I think you could find nationalism and imperialism too.
Yeah. I mean, to me, this almost seems more like, it seems like nationalism is the more adaptable ideology. Maybe, like, I don't know, this is something, because I like study nationalism as part of like my project too, but it seems that like nationalism is just able to kind of morph no matter the situation and always find a way into like people's hearts and minds somehow. Like no matter what the situation is, it seems like nationalism has always won in like the modern world. Like no matter what you do, that ends up being the most overriding powerful motivation of people somehow.
Well, I think it's one of a few things like that, but that's sort of like the it's extraordinarily appealing, and when the World Cup starts, you're gonna see it. Like people like who otherwise would not interact in everyday life. Oh, because we both like Portugal, you are my brother. Like that's an extraordinary power that you can't really find elsewhere. Like where else do you get that kind of immediate community? Like you don't know if this person was born in Portugal, if this person has never been to Portugal, but the fact is they're putting on a Portugal jersey, so this person is now my brother. It's an extraordinarily powerful thing, and I think that's why nationalism sort of like goes beyond all of these ideologies. Like how can the revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries claim to be the true nationalists? It's crazy. So
yeah, exactly. But they're both talking about the nation at the end of the day.
Right.
Which is
and which we talked about in our last episode about human rights. It's almost contradictory.
So these episodes go together nicely. But yeah, it's complicated, and I think these weird complications are only gonna get worse, I think, as time goes on, as the tensions of the modern world continue to build, where we're all sort of subject to the whim and basically control of giant, international corporations and business that doesn't really have any loyalty to any one place. And as our lives become more interconnected, we're also then going to have to deal with sort of, I feel like, what is a basic kind of like sense that human beings want to belong. And there's also, I think, maybe perhaps because I'm more cynical about human nature, there's a natural kind of xenophobia, I think, to human communities.
Well, but you look at the countries we're talking about, the ones that we've mentioned, Cuba, North Korea, Nicaragua, it's the reverse. They have community, they have belonging,
and they want to preserve that.
They have all those things, and we're telling them.
Well, and I think this is a funny thing too. Something I thought of is that in the end, communism actually ended up being a very conservative ideology.
Exactly.
You're right, because we think of it as like, it's super left wing and progressive and blah, but that's not actually the case when you look how it was implemented. Right, most communist states you couldn't enter or leave easily, so that meant that you're pretty much rooted where you are. To make the communist economy work, almost every communist country had to introduce some form of like an internal passport, right? You can't just up and move, because that would affect, production values and worker permits and the whole 9 yards. Because if you have a planned economy, you got to make sure people are where they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right.
So people can't also just move freely within the country, which also means that you're sort of like in a particular place for the long haul. And then, of course, usually this also results in, I think, a lot of like ethnic homogenization, because it's like you kind of lock down the population, so no one's getting in or out. And so this creates a lot of homogeneity culturally, and so it just means that in the end, if you're thinking of conservation or conservative ideology as preserving things, communism does a great job of preserving people and preserving nations.
Which is why these countries have things like have characteristics of belonging that you were more likely to see in 1950s United States.
Yeah, exactly. Right, in America, we think of like the homogeneity of like the suburbs and blah, blah, blah. That's like the whole country under communism. And so I think it's no accident then that after the collapse of communism, a lot of the states that were communist are now becoming deeply right-wing, because in the face of a big global capitalist economy where there's people move freely, especially in Europe, right? There's the refugee crisis, the circulation of goods. That's going to freak people out who are used to living under a super homogeneic society for decades. I think that's no coincidence that then they're going to be the first states that are going to be like, no, we don't want these people coming in. We don't want these products. We want our old way of life back.
And that nicely brings us back to where we started, this sort of tension between revolutionaries, counter-revolutionaries, and I like to think I threw empire.
Be a conservative.
Empire
Become
in
a
there
communist.
Yeah, I know. Communism, most conservative ideology out there. All right, so not quite.
Not quite, but I see the point. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for another great episode of Hour of History. Remember, we have all the old episodes on hourofhistory.com and a new cities podcast coming at you every Wednesday. New Hour of History podcast every Saturday. Thanks for joining Hour of History, our world, anytime, any place.
Have a good one.